What are you gonna do? Peace now or never.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jim Hemphill. I write about movies for IndieWire, and I'm very excited to welcome you for this discussion of the post-production sound and production sound, for that matter, of the Nickel Boys. So thank you guys all for coming here. It's really an incredible movie. And I guess I just want to dive right in by asking what kinds of conversations each of you had with Ramel Ross coming into this. And, you know, one of the interesting things about the movie, obviously, is this first-person approach that it takes. And I'm curious from all of you how that informed your approach going in and what your initial conversations were like with the director. I guess, Nicholas, we could start with you.
We talked a bit in prep to make sure like the timing would work of things, and just generally they would be able to capture everything they needed. And then knowing that there was going to be a lot of experimentation after. And so the POV thing really, when I read the script, was just an immediate relief, because it solved what I did not understand how you would solve of making that novel into a movie. So I was instantly just impressed by that bold move that really did activate it in a way. So it's very exciting. And then I was also very heartened to hear the team that he had planned for sound, because I knew it would be a unique one with a really unique soundscape and approach to sound in general. So that was exciting to know that we were going into something unique and there would be a lot of experimentation.
And Mark, does that experimental approach to the visuals, again, that first person idea, does that affect your job? And if so, how?
There were technical hurdles we had to overcome. That camera rig, on the very first day, it was a rubber ball and it squeaked. And that lived for about the first 4 takes, in which we flipped it into something a little more quiet. And then Jomo figured it out, and it was quiet from then on. But the first conversations with Ramel, he really wanted to paint a picture for the audience of what we could inform them of what was happening off camera, and not just our normal on-set dialogue capture. So it was the first time in my career we were able to run stereo microphones both on the camera and with second booms. So there was a little bit of a technical hurdle of finding the proper equipment to capture the stereo image and hope that post could do something with it and to notate it as such. So it wasn't just boom 1, boom 2, boom 3. It was boom left, boom right, and making little marks on the microphone to know that the left and right were properly oriented each time we deployed it. But other than that, it was pretty straightforward, but an amazing experience for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so, Dan and Tony, coming into this, what did you guys see as the kind of overall guiding principles for the sound design?
Well, Dan, I'll jump in here first, because I wanted to first say that Dan and I had the pleasure of working with Ramel on his first film, his documentary, Hale County. And just from even before having a discussion about this project, Dan and I think knew what we were in for, because having worked with him before, he's so creative and so into sound and plans for sound that we knew we'd be in for another exciting ride on this. And then once we read the script, met with Ramel, we talked a lot about, how to convey this first person voice, especially the voice of the camera. When you're not seeing the person, but you're hearing the person. We had numerous discussions about how we wanted to treat that. But one of the things we discovered that was a carryover from Hale County was when we worked on that, Dan and I kind of had like a little laboratory set up where Dan would work for days or weeks doing some sound design, and we'd get together usually on a weekend and Ramel would come in, and it was like a science experiment. We would just play around, and all of us would sound design kind of together and come up with great ideas. And it was really inspiring. And I knew going into this film that we didn't want to lose that. Even though this was a bigger budget and more conventional schedule, I didn't want Ramel to just show up after the pre-mix and hear our stuff for the first time. It just wasn't going to work. So we gave up a few mix days to come in really early on in the process and play Ramel some of the ideas. Dan had, I'll let Dan talk about it here in a second, but he set up a way of conveying the sound effects in this POV world, and I'd come up with a dialogue treatment, and we wanted to make sure that Nick and Ramel were happy with the way that we were going in that direction before we got too far into the process. So it was very unusual and unique. I'll let Dan chime in on his side.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun, right? I mean, I guess I want to say first, it was nice getting the project in such great shape from editorial too. Like Nick and Alex and Scott had tons of time to kind of do this back and forth together. From what I saw, offline collaboration and sound before it even touched our desk. And Nick had kind of set the table for how wide the world would be. For example, it was introduced really early on that we'd be experimenting with the panning of the voices and kind of everything. So a lot of my task was to see everything. So the first part of my task was to figure out how big that should be. So I went as big as possible. And, and I guess from anyone who knows Ramel, you just want to see him go whoa, and then see him go, no, we can't do that, and then kind of just feel out those guide rails, because he's just so, his sense of play and just wanting to experiment you get lost in it all day. So to find those parameters was, as fun as it, always is with with him. I'm pretty proud of the result too. A lot of it was just honing things in so that they'd remain, legible and be cinematic, yet also, kind of fit the aspect ratio too. Because not only is it first person, it's almost, it's almost a square. Is it a square? It's
squarish.
4:3, but yeah,
it's almost a square. So sound has a real effect on the picture. There's nothing that sound can do that it's going to sound like it sounded, in the offline, just in stereo. Putting up this huge, almost square in a theater, with any kind of surround sound is just a drastically different experience. And so we just leaned into making a sphere, if you will, of the world. A lot of the job is always playing off camera and expanding the world off the frame, but this one, it was such a different task, because there's so much left to the imagination once you get outside that square. Are we feeling claustrophobic in our own bodies, or are we kind of lost in this infinite childlike sense of wonder of just exploring little objects and movements and stuff, and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So it was fun.
And now, Alex and Scott, you guys also have worked with Ramel before. So how early in the process does he bring you in, and what were your initial conversations like?
Sure, I'll go first. Really early. We were so lucky. We were sent the script before the shooting began, and we started having creative conversations with Ramel, and then we really started a couple weeks before we visited the film set. And we ended up getting to go to the film set the final 5 days of shooting. And we showed up with a little mobile studio and some demos to play Ramel. And we had a nice session with him in his trailer where we played him a bunch of demos, and we talked about, big picture stuff, and kind of saw what he resonated with in the batch of demos and what he didn't. And that kind of informed the process. So yeah, we were fortunate enough to be brought in very early. And of course, Scott and I also worked on Hale County, his previous film. So we kind of know the world in which Ramel likes to build. And that world, for some reason, it pairs so nicely with our music. You know, the music is pretty textured and slow and environmental. So the pairing of just organically of what Scott and I tend to do with the way Ramel tends to shoot the world, it's just such an interesting pairing that we are really curious about and still don't really understand how it works, but we're always like circling it and trying to lean into it and yeah, make that spark.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that yeah, we like to kind of, in our music that we make together, we like to collage a lot of elements, like builds with like songs with like acoustic instruments, but then also like field recordings and other sounds and a lot of post-processing. And we kind of treat each sound like an electronic musician might, even though they're all natural sounds. But then we play with them a lot. And I think that for me, that kind of relates a lot to the way that Ramel works with imagery, using archival footage and using like, yeah, kind of close focus. And so there's kind of that really great overlap with the way we all work in terms of process. And then I would say also that Alex and I kind of knew from working with Ramel before that if we made a lot of stuff and gave Ramel the chance to listen, we knew he wouldn't be fussy. He would just kind of, you know, like operate on instinct and just like listen to a lot of things very quickly. And then we could kind of pick up the crumbs of what he was leaving. Because he didn't give us a lot of notes or direction. He kind of was just wanted us to make music that we would make. And of course we had the story and the script in our heads and in our minds. But we were kind of just in the studio working and then tried to deliver as much as we could.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the archival footage. That actually raises a question for Nicholas as well as Daniel and Tony. I'm curious, just Nicholas, first of all, if you could talk about the incorporation of the archival footage and what the thinking was there. And then I'm also interested in, just from a sound perspective, how you kind of treat the sound from that archival sound, how you integrate it with the, you know, quote unquote, real material, you know, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, as a new collaborator with Ramel, I had watched Hale County and looked also at some of his writings about art and his artwork, and had read the novel and was starting to connect those dots when we started to talk about how that language, or at least how the edit was going to work to figure out that language, and how early he wanted to see attempts at incorporating it. Some of it was very integral to his plan, like using the Dozier report on the school was always part of the original research. And him and Jocelyn have talked a lot about how they wrote the script as this attempting to go back to the same material that in a lot of ways Coulson had drawn from, because we're now going from the visual to the visual, not text to text or visual to text. So it was a different translation, so we couldn't just kind of pull from the book, kind of had to go one step back. So he had already done a lot of research on that and written a lot of it into the script. So even in the script, you could kind of go look at what he was talking about, some of it, some of the clips. A lot of it had to change just because of the legalities of all of it. So it was a dance always of, can we use this clip? Are we still looking for something? Can we find something similar? And then what is this? Because I think the real materiality of the provenance of some of this material is part of the conceptual work that we're doing, like with the same way, you know, Alex and Scott are talking about using field recordings. Like, it's not random field recordings. You might not be able to predict what it is, but there's something to where this material comes from and what it represents that's part of it. So it was sort of, you have to work on intuition because it's almost too many variables to think about like analytically, but we would step back and talk about it as we would watch stuff. Some things would only make sense once a certain piece of music came in from Alex and Scott, and it would be like, oh my God, now this clip that we had no sound for necessarily, or the original sound wasn't activated yet, and it wasn't finding its place in the film until we married all four of these aspects with the sound design, some temp sound design ideas, some of the early music ideas, some archival footage and some of the scripted footage, and then it was you couldn't do it in any order other than all at once, and we had to kind of keep building new sections that had all of it and realizing, well, that's okay, but let's try another completely different version, and then we would step back and watch a lot of different versions of these things. So it was, yeah, I mean, it's hard to break down because every scene had a completely different process to get to how it got there, but it was really exciting to work as somebody who loves working on documentary and scripted footage, to be able to think about it all as kind of meaning and how they relate was really exciting.
There's something you did, like the way you treated the archival, Nick, like it's like almost like we're like condensing time, like we're not going back in time to black and white and going back to the present moment. It's so special. Like it feels like we're just amplifying the momentum. I'm thinking of like when we're coming into the police car, as a really good example. Like we're not looking at an old piece of archival footage for a moment. We're living both of these parallel timelines and then launching out of it into like one of the most powerful, I think, sound scenes in the movie. And I think that says something about like how Ramel works too. Is like I'm constantly getting props, for like, oh, that was really cool what you did, but no, that's actually something that Nick did. And I know Alex and Scott have received something like, oh no, that's something that Dan did. But like Ramel is constantly making this kind of like hidden, sphere of of work that it's just the work.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think a lot of the archival was unlike a lot of films, when the archival comes up, it's treated as is, just like the Defiant ones in this movie. We played that kind of raw, just as is.
Yep.
But it was the transitions out of those moments that were really special. That's one of my favorite moments. With Nick had this, wiper sound, overlapping, as a transition element into the police car, on the way to the academy. I think I'm thinking of the right scene. I hope I am.
Mm-hmm.
But and more often than not, I think the archival stuff was carried with the music and the score that that Alex and Scott had provided. It was more surreal, less just straight up archival news footage, if you will, but more used as another way to sort of get you out of the real world and experiencing something more expansive.
Yeah. Ramel gave us all like so much freedom, and he's not tethered to reality in the way a lot of filmmakers are, and he would embrace this collage mentality, which he's used in Hale County and in Nickel Boys. And I think it's just how he sees the world and how he makes visual works is like, like this thing of, you can't, when you're composing the music for a film, there's just things you can't do, like field record something and put it on screen to a scene where that thing that you've recorded is not happening before your eyes. No filmmaker would let you do that. But Ramel is like thrilled by that very premise, and he encouraged it, and it's happening all throughout the film. And the soundscape to this film, whether it's sound design or music or just the overall feeling from both of them married, is really experimental, maybe even more so than people would realize. It's just like crazy shit happening everywhere. And it's like, for me, I've been obsessed with sound my whole life, and it's been the most thrilling process. Just wanted to add all that because like, you don't get to do this with film scoring. You don't get to record, nature frogs and then put them on a screen where there's no frogs on the screen, or like a broken ceiling fan that's just like mimicking some like feeling of like circular dread or something, and put it with a scene that has no broken ceiling fan. Like there's just so much play and experimentation to try to get at this, like how it feels. It's all tied to like the feeling of Ramel's work. Everything he makes is so ripe with like feeling, and is dripping with atmosphere and character, and it's very beautiful, and it's very sensory rich. And we all just like got excited by that and tried to make a soundscape and music that was sensory rich and not held to the confines of normal reality and what you can and can't do. So we kind of just like broke all the rules and had fun.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up like the nature sounds in the movie, because there are a lot of really beautiful, just expressive nature sounds from the, you know, the just the way like even the grass kind of crunches as that people lay down on it and things like that. And so I was wondering from Mark and Tony and Dan, if you guys could talk a little bit about how you guys just the capturing of those sounds, and then how you're treating them in post to give this just like kind of like really tactile, visceral feel that they have in the movie.
Dan?
Well, I mean, thank you, Mark, for sticking those mics on your cameras. I know. We did indeed use some of that, but we did carry over the approach a lot to the Foley too. We shot a lot of the Foley in stereo mid-side, which was fun to experiment with too. It kind of gave it from time to time when what we were calling throne gazes were happening, gave those a bit of that 3D texture that Ramel was looking for. But everything,
the throne gaze that Dan's talking about is like these really close-up, super in-your-face shots. We called those throne gazes. And Dan's right. We used like the MS recordings from the Foley department that were recorded in stereo, so that all of a sudden this soundscape, even though you're in super tight, the sound would open up.
Yeah, so hopefully it sounds as good in headphones as it does in a big theater. You know, everything's cast into an ambisonic sphere. So a lot of what I was running into is just making things sound center enough, and learning how to like get the kind of wield the power of the sphere, you know, and kind of make it work.
Yeah, what I want to talk about too, Dan, is that what I've thinking about this. I've been thinking about that. The big difference in this film and almost every other film we've ever worked on is that there's always POV in our sound design. You know, we're always, you know, like, okay, there's a radio playing on my left, and so I'm panning the radio over there to the left, and then the shot reverses, and oh, now I pan it over here to the right. But everything in traditional filmmaking is very static, kind of mostly for these POV things. Like they kind of go with each shot. But with Ramel's film and the way that Nick has put together the film, it's flowing, and it's you are the camera, and all the movements are flowing. So Dan and I had to come up with a concept of not these static POV shifts, but being able to have it constantly moving as following the camera movement. Had to match that, either, you know, be fast, slow, wide, narrow, whatever the focus was, and it was constantly moving. So that was the biggest, I think, number one change, you know, between this and a traditional type of mix. The panning never stopped. The head moves a little bit. All of a sudden, the focus is, you know, everything shifts a little bit. So
yeah,
that's actually have things jump around statically. They had to flow.
That's actually why I went with that ambisonic approach. Was, you know, I did want to pan everything outside of a cube and go into a sphere and have the visual too. So each thing is, you know, being panned independently, but then also to be able to use other software to like shift global movements of that as an orb. That's what kind of led me down that path.
Well, Dan, you brought up something earlier that I wanted to kind of circle back to, which is when you were talking about the aspect ratio, and you were kind of talking about, in a way, like the things that the movie omits or leaves to the imagination that you have to fill in. And one of those is the violence. Like the movie is, the content is in a way very violent, and yet you don't really see the violence. And I'm curious how that, for all of you, like how that informs your approach.
That is a great question, Jim. If anyone wants to pick it up, I can sit on that for a sec and give it a good answer.
I'll use it as a way to segue from something I've wanted to say, which is as you each described these sort of really ambitious experimental approaches to each of your roles, it just reminded me that like none of that all sounds amazing and fun, but it just doesn't work without either the boldness to really like confidently lay those rules out for the audience early on and gain their trust that they're going with very decisive moves and not try and sneak it in, like the POV aspect, the spherical aspect, the weird aspects, the unusual layers of sound in the music. I just think it's worth saying that like all of those elements are created incredibly like pristinely and professionally, even though they might be odd, so that then you can move it. And it wouldn't have worked without very good production sound. Like none of it would have worked without that. So you had to have that base to then push it further. So I'll just say that did maybe also apply to your question about the violence, just in that, I mean, I think I've worked in some horror also, and I think we all kind of know in horror that often what your mind creates is not only scarier or worse, but leaves a deeper impact than another image that's been created and put in front of you, which we come across all day long. But the part that you create kind of sticks there longer. So I think that was definitely the goal. And then I think from the book, and then also just hearing Ramel and Jocelyn talk about it before and through production, just think we knew that this movie was not meant to re-traumatize anyone or newly traumatize anyone, yet had to do justice to the severity of what was going on and the reality that this film represents. So even if they had filmed it, we probably would have ended up not showing, just because I think intuitively that would not have meshed with the approach they were taking in every other aspect of the acting and the music and the, it just wouldn't have meshed, I don't think.
Really well said, Nick. I think like the film is like as much of a provocation at times as like a film, and I know it's like a pretty like well-known like sound film trope to like hear one thing but see it but be shown another thing. And this, like, some of the scenes in this movie take it to a whole nother extreme where you're just being challenged to like feel, and also almost like feel death, like feel the extreme emotions of pain, and also totally disappear. And it's a huge challenge to the audience. But yeah, I think like Nick said, it's not about the suffering purely or trauma or anything. It's about Ramel's inviting everyone to work through it together in the room. And I think it's really effective at that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Ramel's vision is amazing. I think he's just not very curious and excited to make films that look and feel like other films we've seen. And I think that would have been a more traditional approach that a lot of people would have been fine with. But I think anytime Scott and I tried to create music and kind of score a scene, any scene, let alone especially one of the more brutal scenes, it just felt prescriptive to him and a little bit taking a cheapo route. So like by never like really scoring the film in a traditional way and just create like pieces of music that can be thinned out or built up and kind of strategically laid to picture that kind of do something that a typical score doesn't do, was like really appealing to Ramel. And that's why I said at the beginning, we're still kind of like curious about the pairing of like our music and his images, because it's just kind of like interesting, and like I don't quite have it like figured out. There's no recipe. I just know that it's like it's interesting when certain pieces get laid to picture. And I think we were following his instinct about not making it really feel like film music. And I think by scoring those scenes, you make it feel like a film. It gives it drama. But I think it gives it something else if you don't do that. It's more like Ramel's cinema language that's kind of just different. And I personally am really moved by it and get a lot of impact from it. But it's different than your average film,
I love films that soundtrack. It's difficult to discern whether is that music or is that the sound design, or and this is one of those films. Like Alex and Scott's music is gorgeous and it's great, but there's many times in the film where you're not sure what you're listening to.
For sure.
And that's the strength. It's just it flows in and out of the sound design, and sound design flows in and out with the music to the point where it's just indistinguishable. It's all one. It's kind of like what you've been saying all along. There's just everything working together.
Yeah, there's a lot of harmony between all the layers. Like really,
Yeah.
really fulfilled with this collaboration. It's been great.
And about the not showing the violence, that was definitely a conscious decision from Rommel right from the get-go. And it's, I think for us sound editors, it's probably one of the biggest challenges always to create off-screen emotion and tension and sound to convey something that you're not seeing. It's always much easier to, you see a bomb explode and you put a bomb explosion in there. And it's like, yeah, okay, everyone can do that. But to create something that you're not seeing, you have this, a clean palette to do almost anything,
Right.
and create it from scratch. And Dan obviously did an amazing job creating these moments of tension and emotion.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great movie, and you all did terrific work. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come here and talk with me about it.
Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Jim.